today we're going to be lowering the Z. So I installed some springs on the Z when I first got it. They were in the box of the car. I don't know what brand they were or anything like that, but once we put the new tires on it and got it back on the ground, we had a problem. The problem is, while the back was lowered very nicely and has a really nice fitment to it, the front, well, it looks like we're getting a nosebleed over here. There's just way too much wheel gap. So, bought a set of BC Racing coilovers, and we're going to install them on the car and try to get rid of some of that gap. Now, the reason to switch over to coilovers is that in addition to having almost infinite adjustability up or down with the suspension, I'm also going to have a much better ride than what was in the car from stock. This sounds pretty counterintuitive, but any modern suspension is going to outperform something that was done 40 years ago. For your average home mechanic, this is a pretty easy process on most cars. But on the Datsun, this is a little bit more of a difficult install. You're not just swapping parts, you actually have to do some cutting and some welding. If you're not comfortable or familiar with this type of fabrication, your best bet might be to call a performance shop to do this kind of work. I'm not comfortable with cutting my car. It's in overall very nice condition and it's rust-free. I'm also not super comfortable or confident in my welding skills. So let's get started. So why are coilovers so involved on any S30 chassis? Basically, every S30 chassis, which includes 280, 240, and 260Zs, requires you to do the same thing. You have to cut the strut tower and sleeve the coilover on top of the leftover stub. The reason for that is the spindle and strut tower are all one unit. Most modern cars, the strut tower and the spindle are separate units, so way to go, Datsun. While it adds some rigidity and a little less complexity, it causes a problem when you want to change any of the suspension components. So some of the coilover manufacturers offer a core service where you can actually disassemble your whole strut tower, send them the spindles and struts, they'll cut them, weld the sleeves on, and send assembly back to you. Obviously, this is going to add time and cost to your project though. Nobody really sells separated spindles for these cars, but there's a company called Techno Toys Tuning that'll actually sell you a pre-welded coilover and spindle assembly. However, it's a great product, but it's about $1,400 just for the front end of the car. The BC Racing coilovers that I chose were about $1,400 for all four corners. Now, as sketchy as it sounds to cut major suspension components on your car, if it's done properly, it's actually probably going to make as strong, if not stronger, joint. Where the old strut casings were about 1/8 inch thick, now you have double metal where the joint is, so you have almost 1/4 inch of metal there. Now, the second scary part of this for me is that I have to cut the top of my shock towers. You don't have to in every scenario, but for me, if I want access to the camber adjustments or to easily be able to adjust the dampening of the shock, we got to cut the towers. To do this, we're going to be enlarging the existing hole that's on top of the shock tower. Now, technically, you could also cut and weld in camber plates, but I don't need to go that extreme with mine. I just need a little bit of adjustment. Now, I like a really clean engine bay, so for me, this means that I'm going to have to cut it very carefully, smooth out any paint imperfections, and repaint it to prevent rusting. Again, this isn't 100% necessary, but if you want to make any adjustments to the dampening or make any adjustments to the camber plate, you're going to have to drop the shock every time you want to make that change. Theoretically, this isn't going to happen often, but it may be necessary from time to time. You'll probably just set it and forget it. And in my opinion, having the exposed adjustable shock towers just adds a little bit of a racy element to the engine, and I think it looks awesome. So what's the first step in the process? Well, for me, I decided to cheat a little bit. I ordered a set of used strut towers and spindle assemblies from eBay for the left and right front. Because I'm not super comfortable in my welding skills, I decided to order these extra towers, as I figured I could cut and weld the backup spindles while I still get to enjoy and drive my car. And then when I'm ready to actually make the swap, I can jack it up, swap everything over, and then move on. This turned out not to be necessary, and I'll show you why. So here is the driver's and the passenger side. I believe this is the driver's side because the brake is on the back side of the car towards the rear. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut these about 1.5 inches up from the bottom sleeve here, about 1.5 inches from there, and once we cut that, we'll be able to slide the BC Racing coilover on top of it. I mark the coilovers with some tape. I start the cut with a grinder and then finish it with a sawzall. This is what the spindles should look like when you're done. Then I clean up all the edges with a sanding wheel and make sure they're ready to weld. I then repeat the process for the other spindle. I grabbed one of the coilovers to test the fit, and Houston, we have a problem. I was trying to get ahead of the game, so I picked up some strut towers for a 280Z, some extra ones that I could cut. Now the reason this isn't going to work is because when I ordered these, instead of sending me 280 ones, they sent me 240 ones. What's the difference? The 240s are 51 millimeters, whereas the 280s are actually 55 millimeters. And so the BC coils that I have, they won't sleeve over it properly. There's too much gap. So we're just going to cut the stock spindles. I wasn't a big fan of that. I wanted to keep these factory, but I suppose if somebody ever wants to put this car back to factory and get rid of the coilovers, you could just order a whole new strut tower like I just did, but just not cut them. So let's get the car jacked up and get these spindles off and start cutting. Now, because I'm limited in space in my garage, what I'm going to do is work on one side at a time. Jack this side of the car up, take the wheels off, pull the struts out, get that all done, and then bolt it all back together, drop it, flip it around, do the other side. I jack the car up, remove the wheels. I start with removing the top 3 nuts in the engine bay. I believe they're 13 or 14 millimeter, I can't recall. Then I compress the springs to get some play. Sit and stare at it a bit and ponder what you just got yourself into. Then I remove the compression rod from the control arm, which I didn't actually need to do. I remove the sway bar end link bushing. I believe this is 14 millimeter also. It might be under tension, so just watch out when you remove it. I'm trying to decide if I need to take this steering arm off or not. A little bit more. I realized that I can't actually get the brake line out of the clip because it's a solid unit, so now I have to disassemble the brake line. This means I have to re-bleed my brakes. I remove the line and reassemble it quickly outside of the bracket, just to minimize fluid loss. Then I proceed to remove the brake caliper. I believe this is 2 17mm bolts from the back of the rotor plate. I remove the 2 17mm bolts that hold the steering knuckle to the spindle, then reach up into the tower and pull down on the shock. It'll compress with some slight pressure and you'll be able to angle it out of the car. Once it's clear of the fender, you can just give it a wiggle and pop it off with the steering knuckle. The entire shock spindle and rotor will all come out as one unit. Watch your toes, it's heavy. Okay, so here is the full shock and brake assembly removed. So let's look back over here what had to come off. What we did was took the 2 bolts off of the bottom of this spindle to steering arm bracket, took those off, and that allowed us to slide the sleeve up, pop that off. I did take this tie rod, connecting rod, I don't know what the fuck rod this is, whatever rod that is. I did take the 2 bolts off of that, which gave me some more play in this, and I also took the sway bar link off. The brake I just reattached and put back up here to stop it from leaking, so hopefully that'll stop now and I'm not going to lose all my brake fluid. So you can look up in here in the shock tower. So what we're going to be doing is removing a little bit of material here. Not a whole lot. We're going to get closer to those bolts, but what we're going to do is just kind of route it out a little bit so it gives us access to the adjustability. The next step here is we're going to pull this cap off. The spring is loose now. It's not putting any tension on it, so I should be able to take that top bolt right off. And then I'm going to take the shock that's in it out. I'm relatively sure this is no longer under any tension, but we're going to aim it this way just in case. Remove the single top nut on the top of the strut. This should be a 17mm also, I believe. Unscrew the top nut that actually holds the shock into place. This might be a little bit different for different years, but it's basically a large hex nut that's at the base of the shiny part of the shock. Now remove the shock from the housing. I've seen a few people speed up this process by just cutting right through the housing and the shock without removing the shock or the spring. It is totally doable. That's not the part that's under tension from the spring, and there's no fire risk. But it is really messy as all the fluid that's in the shock is just going to leak everywhere. Now, in the interest of being lazy and the fact that my brakes and bearings were recently done when I got the car, I'm going to leave the brake rotor, bearings, and the whole assembly all together in one piece while I cut and weld it. However, if you need to rebuild your brakes, now's a great time while they're out of the car. Okay, so we already did this once, but we're going to go through it again. We're going to be cutting this. So here's the old one that I already cut, and there's the new one. So here is where this measures 50 mil. And when we go to put that on this one, it doesn't go. Now it fits, and it is at 55. So this is the correct size for my sleeve, and I'll show you that once we get this lopped off here. You need to mark and cut the shock housing 45 millimeters from the top of the spindle where the shock tower meets it. I use tape to create a nice clean ring so I can watch my cut. Time for your first major cut. Don't fuck it up. I use a cutoff wheel to start a good groove, and then a sawzall with a metal blade makes quick work of it. Easy peasy, cuts like butter. Just make sure you don't cut the spindle arm or any other parts of the brakes. It's kind of clunky to get the blade into that area. Once it's all cut, I clean it up with a wire brush and some brake clean. I make sure to file or grind down any high spots or burrs. Now you can spray this part with some weld through primer, just to keep it protected, and then on to welding. Alright, now that this is all cleaned up, here is how the sleeve's on. So there's not a lot of rotation to this, they'll pretty much just sit right there. Now, depending on the brand, there's a little notch in the sleeve of the coilover. This fits the little bump on the spindle. If your coilover sleeve doesn't have this, then you may have to create one yourself because you want this to sit all the way flush to the edge of the spindle. The BC Racing coilovers have this notch, and they're also labeled front left, front right, and then the rears are interchangeable. There's an adjustable brake line holder right here, and you can slide it up and down. And here's the rest of the coilover. I probably should have measured how big the old shock was, so I could adjust this kind of to that spot, but we didn't. So we're just gonna get this in as is and kind of go from there. You can see how snug that is there, and how on these it is very loose. On this one, almost no movement at all. Once we weld that in, perfect. So, I mean, realistically, welding's the next step. I won't lie, I'm a little nervous about it. Let's see how it goes. So I don't know if I'm more nervous about welding this piece in, or the fact that I have to cut this tower right here. Alright, confession time. I am not a very good welder. Actually, maybe I am. I just don't weld a whole lot. So we're gonna do a couple little test runs and then give it a shot. The way my coilovers are constructed, I can unscrew the bottom part of it. Not all of them are like this, but it makes it a lot easier if they are when you're trying to balance this whole rotor assembly while you're trying to weld it. Next, lay down some sloppy sweet welds. Or take it to somebody to lay down some better welds. Alright, so that's not the worst weld I've ever done. It is definitely penetrated. I was able to get more or less back up in there. It's kind of hard to get back up into this spot, but I got up and in there as best I could. That's probably the worst spatter of it and the worst looking spot, but it's just too hard to get in there. Maybe the TIG torch or something, I don't know. Tacked it 3 times here, and that's where those high spots are. It's just where the tack was, me running up to it. So I'll get this painted and sealed, and then we'll get the shock screwed back in, get it back on the car. I paint the raw metal with some epoxy paint. I'm not going for a perfect powder coat here, I just want to prevent the rust. Then I let it sit in the sun to dry a bit. So what we're going to do, like I said, is we're going to get a 2-inch hole saw. We're going to cut around this bead right here, and then right along this line we're going to grind some of that out, and then when we get the shock up in there we should be able to have full access to the adjustments. So the way that this shock goes in, we should have access to those set screws to adjust the camber a little bit, and we'll have access to the softened hardness of the actual shock. So let's get cutting. First, I use a good heavy-duty 51mm metal saw drill bit. this starts to widen the hole. It fits nice and snug around the ridge of the existing hole, and that keeps the blade centered while you cut.
It was absolutely painful to do. Oh. So, that is that. Original panels, be damned. So, that came off pretty easily. Now we're gonna just clean this up. So you can see how much material we're gonna have to remove. Just these little ears right here. And then we'll get it all sanded smooth, and I'm gonna repaint it in that blue, and then we'll be good to go.
I then use a body saw to hog out some of the bigger areas of metal. Then I start refining the opening with a carbide bit and Dremel tool, slowly working away the rest of the metal. I use the shape of the existing folded over metal to help shape the new opening, cutting right up to the edge with the carbide bit. Why do I feel like I'm at the dentist, but I am the dentist? I then use a sanding drum in the Dremel to smooth it out the rest of the way.
Okay, so here is the finished opening. Everything is nice and smooth. I'm going to give it a little light sanding. Some degreaser.
I spray a bit of black epoxy paint from below to coat the raw edges of the metal.
And then I'm going to mask off this area here and get that paint.
I apply a coat of body matched paint to clean up the top side. I'll also follow this up with a few coats of clear. I have to do that 3 more times. But first, let's reinstall the coilover onto the steering knuckle after properly adjusting the right height. Because I didn't keep track of the old height, I just guessed. But I nailed it. Your results may vary, but mine was 31 millimeters in the front between the 2 gold coilover rings. Here's our first look at the finished product in the engine bay. Nice. On to the back. I jack the car up and remove the wheel. At this point, I have a little more confidence in my cutting and welding skills. Plus, I'm lazy. So we're going to do this a slightly different way.
So I saw a neato little trick where somebody loosened all this stuff and tipped out the shock tower and actually cut and welded it in place. We might try that. But to do that, I definitely need to get this half shaft detached and this sway bar link. So I'm going to take those 2 off first and then see what kind of pivot I have once I get the shock tower removed from the top up there. Alright, let's try this.
I removed the sway bar end link. This is 14 millimeters also, and under tension also. When I get a good look at the brake clips, I decide to go a different route.
Here's what we're going to do next. We're going to pull this clip out. We're going to put a little notch here so I can actually remove this brake line. We're going to disconnect the parking brake. We're going to remove these bolts here. They should be 14 mil, I believe. Get rid of that so the half shaft can come out. We'll take the nuts off of the top of the shock tower. We're going to compress this. We'll drop the whole assembly down.
We remove the plastic plate covering the tops of the shock tower. They're held on with 3 screws, or less if you've lost them over the last few decades. Remove the nuts.
Now the tedious task of removing the 4 nuts on the axle half shafts. These nuts are pretty impossible to get at. I was using a 9/16 and a 14 mil, which was probably part of the problem. But just be careful not to round over your nuts. After a bunch of fiddling, I remove the cotter pin that holds the parking brake cable. I attach the spring compressors and begin taking tension off the springs. There's not a lot of room on this one, it's a tight fit and I can only grab a few coils. Now I use the body saw to notch the brake line retainers. Once this is all reinstalled and the clip is put on, it should be just as secure as from the factory. For now I bend it out of the way, but I'll return it to shape once I put it all back together. I push down on the top hat again and angle it outside the fender. Since the spring is not under any tension, I can now remove the 17mm top hat bolt and remove the spring assembly. I again remove the top nut holding the shock and the housing. This one's really stuck in there. And remove the shock itself, which is leaking. I measure and tape off the 45mm line to cut at, and I start by making a notch on the housing again. I switch over to the Sawzall and finish off the cut. There's considerably more room in here to cut and weld. I clean up all the edges again, wire brush, file, and sand the surfaces ready to be welded. Since the shock leaked, I cleaned up any excess fluid in the housing. Don't worry, this shouldn't be flammable. I test fit the coilover sleeve on the stub and get ready to weld. Realizing I'm a few inches from the gas tank, I use my welding apron in a desperate attempt to keep the explosions to a minimum. Even though I'm a man and fire is cool, I also keep the fan blowing at it to keep any would-be fumes going the other way. Now my gas tank is in excellent shape with no vapor leaks, but if you smell gas in your garage, perhaps you should not do it this way.
Okay, that wasn't the worst. This is all welded up again now. Not too bad for 2 welds in the last probably year and a half. Alright, let's get the coil on and get this all buttoned back up.
Shoot it with some black epoxy paint.
So I'm going to try to shoot for an overall height of about 24, 25 inches. That's where the old shocks were in the back, which looked pretty decent. There was a little bit of a rub on the tire, so I'm going to bring it up just a hair. But we'll see where that starts, and then we'll make some adjustments from there.
I end up making the gap back here between the 2 gold rings 91mm. This space is just a starting point, and it's going to vary based on the specific dynamics of your car, including your wheel and tire size and how heavy the car is.
Okay, so we're going to do the same thing, get that 2-inch hole saw and take that out, and then make some adjustments so we have access to the camber adjustment on the coilover.
I again mask off the top plate in the rear and start reaming. A little more Dremel action. And some more painting. I put the jack under the assembly and negotiate it back in place.
So, somehow while I was disassembling it, I lost the last bushing on the sway bar link. The whole unit's under tension, and when I undid the bolt, it kind of shot somewhere, and I cannot find it anywhere in my garage. I have no idea where it went. So, luckily, I have some polyurethane replacements. These were actually in the box when I purchased the car, so we're going to get those put on, and I'll put them just in the back for now. When I get to the other side, I'll do the other 4, and then eventually I'll pick up a set for the front, but right now, this will do for the back. The way these go is with the little nipple side to where the metal is going to connect. Do a washer first. So washer, you put another rubber one with the nipple side down, then another little washer, and this little ferrule here. This is a little spacer that'll keep it separated. Then you do another washer, then nipple side up to this one, and then another with nipple side down, and another washer. Oops, that's how that other one got lost. On the other side. This is a lock nut on the top of it, and then we'll tighten this all together.
I replaced the parking brake clip, complete with new cotter pin. Replace the clips holding the brake lines in place. And put the tire back on.
So we're going to get this lowered a little bit at a time, see how it goes down, and see what our gaps are. If the spacing isn't good, we're going to jack the car back up and adjust the coilovers. So I actually don't hate this. I think once I get in the car and put some weight in there, it'll push it down the rest of the way. Maybe even when I drive it out. I mean, it's massively better than what it was here. And it looks like I actually have some decent turning and suspension travel. I could probably lower it a little bit more. I don't know if I'm gonna or not. I mean, the gap is massively better than what it was. Considering this is the gap where I can almost fit 4 fingers vertically right there, and over here I can't really get 2 in without it starting to tip up. Let's see how the back looks on the stock side. Well, somewhat stock side. Well, I guess it's actually not too bad. It's still lowered, I think, than what that is. That's probably 3 fingers, and then when I'm actually driving it, this is 2 fingers, so that still may bump, but these shocks and springs are a little bit more rigid than the other ones, which when I was in the car last, when I ride in it, I don't know, I might be able to go a little lower with that. Okay, driver's side is done. Got the car out of the garage, moved it back in, facing the other way. Now let's work on the passenger side.
Everything on this side is pretty much the same as the driver's side, although with the added benefit of some hindsight. This whole side gets done in about half the time I spent on the driver's. First, car up, wheels off.
Alright, so I learned a little bit from last time, and what we're actually going to do, rather than disconnect this part of the brake cable, we're actually going to make a little clip right here and just pull it out, and then I should be able to hang the brake assembly back here while I work on the rest of this, and we won't have to bleed the brakes or do anything like that. Alright, now that we've done 2 run-throughs, I have a good procedure for this. Well, I'll probably never get to use it again, but here's the idea. Leave the top shock attached. Lessen the intensity on the springs by compressing them. Remove the sway bar end link. Remove the brake caliper by cutting this little tab open
sliding the caliper out after you attach it from the back of the spindle. Then remove on the bottom of this, these two bolts. They come in from the bottom. They're two, I believe, 17mm bolts. Take those out the bottom, and then now we should be able to push this down and pull it out and get it detached. A little bit of fiddling, but I got that out. Let's get the end cap off of that.
We again make our cuts and weld up the spindles to the front coils. By this point, I've got a better feel for the cutting and welding process, so it all goes much smoother. I move on to the back wheel. I treat the back right the same as the back left. Cut the brake line bracket, disconnect the axle, remove the sway bar, squish the spring down, drop the shock. Keep the whole assembly out of the wheel well, cut the housing, protect the gas tank, and weld the sleeve on. We bore out the top shock mount and Dremel. Reassemble and reinstall.
Alright, so last step is we're going to get this drilled out the rest of the way like the other one, and then get the rotor and shock put in place.
One last time, we use the hole saw and drill out a hole. The body saw makes some relief cuts. And then the Dremel tool with the carbide bit and the sanding drum to clean up the rest of the shock tower. Quick coat of paint. Then I reassemble the sway bar and steering knuckle and get the coil into place. Reattach the brake lines and their brackets. Wheels on and on the ground.
Well, that is it. It is hammered to the ground, so much lower in the front than it was. Really like how it looks right now. Once I got both sides lowered, it made a huge difference. I still may bring that back down a little bit. We're going to see how soft it is back there. I have one really well-known bump spot in my drive back and forth to work. So what I'll do is I'll take it down that and blast down that little bump in the road and see how it feels, because every time I would hit that bump before, the back end would hit. I have these basically set from the factory wherever they were. I don't know if that's good or bad. I'm gonna probably get it to an alignment shop and make sure everything's good, but otherwise, yeah. Go BC Racing Coilovers.
What a transformation. So I've been dreading this installation. I've had these coilovers in my garage since, I don't know, last May I think. I was just super nervous about doing the work and worried that if I started the project I might get hung up, especially since I just got it back on the road after the engine rebuild, so I kind of floundered on this for the better part of a year. Now I just kick myself for not doing it sooner. It really has absolutely changed not only the look, but the driving dynamics of this car. It feels so much more stable and flat. If I have to make a quick lane change or a hard corner, it absorbs all the drama and reacts very predictably with like total control. So that project's all done for now. Again, I apologize for not keeping these videos very regular. I have a lot of halfway started and not finished projects, but as each of them wrap, I just edit them and get them ready as fast as possible. I'm not even going to try this time to predict what the next video you're going to see. It might be a car, it might be a tattoo, I don't know. I did, however, just make another silly purchase. I have a second JDM K car coming. I'll talk about that soon, and I'll be making a new version of my importing a K truck video. Except this one's a K van. But it still hasn't shipped yet, and it's going to take a while to get here, so in the meantime, please subscribe and get notified, and you'll see Biscuit's little brother show up soon enough. Feel free to leave a comment or a question, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks again, and see you next time.